The studio lights hummed. That was the first thing you noticed if you paid attention. The way they never fully went dark between segments. The way they held the room in a permanent golden haze that made every smile look rehearsed, and every nervous laugh sound like it came from someone who had already lost and did not know it yet. The clock on the wall read 3:47. The audience had been seated for 40 minutes. They were the good kind of quiet, the kind that means something is about to happen, the kind that means the room knows it is about to witness something, and every person in it wants to be able to say later that they were there when it did. Ivanka Trump sat in the left chair. She wore navy blue, a blazer with a small gold pin near the collar, and the kind of expression that suggests a person who has been told her entire life that she is the smartest person in any room she walks into. She was leaning forward slightly, not from interest, from anticipation. She had done this before. She knew how these things went. Barack Obama sat in the right chair. He wore gray. He had not touched the water glass in front of him. The host walked them through the pleasantries. The cameras counted down. The room held its breath. And then Ivanka opened her mouth, and for exactly 9 seconds, the room went somewhere no one expected. But to understand how she ended up walking off that stage 27 seconds later, we have to go back to the moment she walked in thinking she had already won. The green room was quiet. That was unusual. Green rooms on these shows are usually loud, assistants checking phones, publicists whispering into earpieces, the low hum of a producer explaining for the third time that the segment would run long because someone always wants the last word. But on this afternoon, the door was closed, and the only sound was the faint hiss of the ventilation system doing its best to make the silence feel comfortable. Barack Obama sat on one end of a leather couch. Michelle sat beside him. They were not holding hands, but the space between them was the kind of space that holds everything that needs to be said and has decided not to say it yet. He had received the talking points 30 minutes earlier. The producer had walked in with a tablet, swiped through 3 slides of context, and left them on the table beside the water bottles. The topic was education policy. The framing was bipartisan. The segment had been sold to the network as a conversation between 2 public figures who happened to disagree about priorities. That was the surface story. The real story was the segment that had aired 6 weeks earlier. Ivanka had done a sit-down interview with a different network. The topic was her father's presidency, but it had drifted, these things always do, into questions about character, about legacy, about the kind of father who raises a son who goes on to run for office. Ivanka had answered with a kind of careful authority, the way someone speaks when they have rehearsed a sentence so many times that it sounds spontaneous. She had talked about discipline. She had talked about expectations. She had talked about the difference between love that enables and love that builds. And then she had said something that the publicist had flagged in the briefing notes with a single red line in the margin. Discipline is not optional, Ivanka had said, and respect is not negotiable. Some people learn that too late. Some people never learn it at all. You can see it in their kids. She had not said a name. She had not needed to. The clip had circulated for 6 weeks. It had been cut into montages. It had been played on commentary shows. It had become a kind of shorthand, Ivanka Trump, lecturing the country about how to raise children, and the implication hanging in every frame that she was talking about the Obamas. Michelle had seen it. She had not said much, which was how Michelle handled things that made her angry. She went quiet, and the quiet did the work that shouting would have done less effectively. She had turned to Barack that morning in the car and said only this: "She thinks she knows something." He had not answered. He had looked out the window at the city moving past and let the moment exist without trying to solve it. That was the thing about Barack Obama that most people who criticized him never understood. He did not solve moments. He endured them. He let them run their course. He trusted that the truth, given enough room to breathe, would find its own shape. Now he sat in the green room with the tablet still on the table and the talking points still unopened. And he was thinking about a conversation he had had with his daughters years ago, in the kitchen of a house in Washington, about what it meant to be strong and what it meant to be kind, and how those 2 things were not opposites but siblings. The producer knocked twice and opened the door. The stage was smaller than it looked on television. That was always the case. The cameras added 20 feet. The lights added atmosphere. But in person, the space between 2 chairs was barely wider than a dining room table, and when you sat down, you could see the tiny scratches on the armrest where someone had rested a watch or a bracelet and not been careful enough. Barack settled into his chair. He crossed one leg over the other. He looked at the camera for a moment, that thing that every person in television learns to do eventually, the way you look at a point just past the lens so that you appear to be making eye contact without actually staring into a hole. And he waited. Ivanka entered from the left. She walked with the posture of someone who had been coached on posture, the kind of straight-backed certainty that says more about what someone was taught than what they actually feel. She sat. She crossed her ankles. She smiled at the host. The host was professional. She had done this for years. She understood that her job was to guide the conversation without steering it, to ask the questions that the audience wanted asked without making it look like she had an agenda. She welcomed them both. She made the introduction. She set the stage. And then she opened the first question to Ivanka. Before we get into the policy discussion, I want to go back to something you said in an interview last month. You talked about discipline and respect as foundational to raising good children. Some people read that as a critique of parenting approaches that prioritize something other than strict structure. Did you mean it that way? This was the setup. The host had handed Ivanka the ball. She had done it cleanly, almost genially, and any other guest would have taken the easy exit, clarified the statement, moved to nuance, let the moment pass without friction. Ivanka did not take the easy exit. She leaned forward. I think what I said was clear, Ivanka said. And I think anyone who heard it understood what I meant. I believe in structure. I believe in boundaries. I believe that children need to understand that actions have consequences and that the job of a parent is not to be liked but to be respected. That is not a controversial statement. It is a foundational one. She paused. The pause was deliberate. She had learned how to use silence from watching her father. You pause when you want the other person to feel the weight of what you just said. You pause when you want them to start talking before you give them the next line. I look around at public figures, Ivanka continued, and I see the results of different parenting approaches. Some children grow up and they are gracious. They are measured. They understand consequence. Others grow up and they are entitled and they believe the world owes them something and they never learn the lesson that no one gets a pass. The audience went quiet, not the good quiet, the nervous quiet. The kind that happens when a room realizes it is in the middle of something that is about to go somewhere it was not supposed to go. Barack did not move. He sat in his chair with his hands resting on his knees and he listened. He listened the way he had listened in Senate hearings, in debates, in the quiet hours of the Oval Office when advisors brought him problems that had no clean solutions. He listened without interrupting. He listened without reacting. He listened as if he was waiting to hear something he had not heard before. That was the discipline that Ivanka did not understand. That was the thing she had never been taught. Listening is not weakness. Listening is the space you create for someone else to make a mistake. The host glanced at her notes. She had a decision to make. She could redirect the conversation back to policy, back to the safe ground they had agreed to cover, and let the moment pass like a cloud across the sun. Or she could hand it to Barack and see what happened. She handed it to Barack. Former President Obama, your response. The silence that followed lasted 12 seconds. 12 seconds in television is an eternity. A producer somewhere in the back of the room shifted in his chair. The floor director held up a hand and checked his watch. The audience sat motionless, aware that something was happening that was not on the script. Barack looked at Ivanka, not at the camera, not at the host, at Ivanka. You said something 6 weeks ago about how some children grow up gracious and measured, and others grow up entitled and believe the world owes them something, he said. His voice was low. It was not quiet because he was trying to be quiet. It was quiet because he did not need to be loud. And you said you could see it in their kids. Ivanka nodded. She was ready for this. She had prepared for this. Yes, she said, I did. Barack held her gaze. I want to make sure I understand you correctly, he said. You believe that children who grow up gracious and measured are the product of strict discipline and clear boundaries, and children who grow up entitled are the product of something else, something that failed them. That's a simplification, but yes, Ivanka said, discipline matters. And you believe that public figures can be evaluated by the behavior of their children. I believe that parenting has consequences. Barack nodded slowly. He reached for the water glass, he took a sip, he set it down. The room waited. The reason I ask, Barack said, is because I'm curious what framework you're using. because I want to make sure I understand the rules you've set up. The framework is simple, Ivanka said. Structure, boundaries, consequences, it's not complicated. No, Barack said, it's not, but I think you may have left something out. Ivanka tilted her head slightly. This was not the response she had expected. She had expected pushback, defensive pushback, the kind that plays well on cable news because it sounds like a fight. She had not expected this. She had not expected someone to look at her like they were trying to help her understand something she had missed. What did I leave out? She asked. Barack leaned back in his chair. He crossed his hands over his stomach. He looked at her the way a teacher looks at a student who has almost understood something but has not quite gotten there yet. You left out the part where children are people, he said. And people are complicated. And the same parents can raise two children, and one of them will be gracious and measured, and the other will make choices that break your heart, and you will spend the rest of your life trying to understand what you did wrong or what you could have done differently. The studio lights hummed. That sound again, the low, constant buzz that you only hear when everything else goes still. My daughters are who they are because of my wife, Barack said, and because of the communities that raised them, and because of schools that challenged them, and because of friends who kept them honest, and because of a faith tradition that taught them that the measure of a person is not what they achieve but how they treat people who cannot do anything for them. Not because I sat them down and explained the rules, because I watched them, and I tried to learn from them. And I tried to be the kind of man they deserved to see. He paused. I want to ask you a question, he said, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Ivanka said nothing. When your father was president, Barack said, and you were in that building and you were watching how he operated and you were learning what power looked like from the inside, what did you think? What did you observe? Ivanka opened her mouth. I observed a president who worked every day to. I'm not asking what you learned, Barack said. I'm asking what you saw, I'm asking what you noticed, because I think you noticed things. I think anyone paying attention noticed things. And I'm curious whether you ever thought about what those things taught you about the difference between strength and cruelty, between authority and control, between the kind of discipline that builds something and the kind that just breaks it down so no one else can build anything either. The room was silent, not the nervous silence of earlier, something else, something heavier, the silence of a question that does not have an easy answer. Ivanka's jaw tightened. You could see it if you were watching closely, the way the muscle in her cheek shifted, the way her posture changed from anticipatory to defensive. She had walked into this room thinking she knew what the conversation would be about. She had prepared her lines. She had rehearsed the tone. She had done the thing that most people do when they step into an arena they have been in before. She had assumed it would go the way it always went. She had assumed the other person would react the way she needed them to react. My father. Your father was your father, Barack said. And you love him. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking whether you think about it. Whether you ever sat alone in a room and asked yourself what you learned about what it means to raise a child who leads versus what it means to raise a child who dominates. Whether you've thought about the difference. Ivanka did not answer. The silence lasted 9 seconds. 9 seconds in that studio, under those lights, in front of an audience that had come expecting one thing and was receiving another, is a very long time. A producer in the back of the room looked at his notes. The host folded her hands on the table. Barack waited. He was not aggressive. He was not smug. He was not performing anything. He was simply sitting in his chair with his hands folded, looking at a woman who had come to teach him something and was now realizing that the lesson had been reversed. The mirror moment. It was not a speech, it was not a takedown. It was a question asked with an patience to make it impossible to answer without saying something true. He had not accused her of anything. He had not attacked her parenting or her character or her choices. He had simply asked her to think about the thing she had assumed she did not need to think about. The room was watching her think. And she could not. Ivanka looked at the host. She looked at the camera. She looked at Barack one more time, and in that look was the recognition, the terrible, quiet recognition that she had been had, not through force, not through argument, through patience, through a kind of strength she did not have a framework to understand because she had never been taught that it existed. She had been taught that strength was volume, that authority was control, that winning was the only thing that mattered and losing was a kind of death that could not be survived. Barack had just shown her another way. And it had broken the script. I'm not going to answer that, Ivanka said. Her voice was flat, controlled. But you could hear the fracture line underneath it, the place where the composure was holding on by a thread. Barack nodded. That's your right. I think this conversation has moved past where it needs to be. I think it moved exactly where it needed to go. Ivanka looked at the host. She did not wait for permission. She uncrossed her ankles. She placed both hands on the armrests of her chair. She stood. I think we're done here, she said. She walked off the stage, not fast, not slow. The kind of walk that someone does when they are trying to look like they are choosing to leave rather than being asked to leave. Her publicist was already moving. The producer was standing. The audience sat very still. The camera stayed on Barack. He picked up the water glass again. He took a sip. He set it down. The host looked at him. Former President Obama, any closing thoughts? Barack sat for a moment. He looked at the chair where Ivanka had been sitting. He looked at the spot on the armrest where her hand had rested. He looked at the audience. Here's what I know, he said. Every parent I have ever respected, man or woman, whatever their politics, whatever their background, every parent I have ever admired has told me the same thing. They said, I don't know if I'm doing this right. I'm just trying to keep up with them. I'm trying to listen. I'm trying to be better than I was yesterday. That is the job, not getting it perfect, not performing it for an audience, just showing up and listening and trying. He paused. And if you get that right, if you show your children that the most important thing is not winning but learning, not dominating but understanding, then whatever else happens, whatever they choose to do with their lives, you will have given them something that no one can take away. He looked at the camera. That is the discipline that matters. The rest is just noise. The segment ended. The host thanked her guests. The camera operators called cut. Barack stood. He buttoned his jacket. He walked off stage toward the green room where Michelle was waiting, and as he walked, he passed the empty chair where Ivanka had sat, and he did not look at it. The audience filed out. The lights were adjusted. The stage was reset for the next segment, which would air in 20 minutes and would be about something else entirely, something that would not matter in a week. But the people who had been in that room would remember the 9 seconds. They would remember the way the silence had held, and the way one person had chosen to sit still while another person chose to leave. They would remember that the strongest thing in that room had not been the loudest voice. It had been the one that did not need to be loud at all. In the green room, Michelle was standing by the window. She had watched the segment on the monitor. She did not say anything when he walked in. She did not ask if he was okay. She simply handed him a glass of water and stood beside him while he drank it. After a moment, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said, "I didn't." "But you did." "Yes." She looked at him. Was it worth it? Barack thought about the question. He thought about the 9 seconds. He thought about the look on Ivanka's face, the fracture line, the place where the script had broken, and he thought about what it might mean if someone like her ever sat alone in a room and asked the question he had asked out loud. "I don't know," he said, "but someone had to ask it." Michelle nodded. She did not smile, but there was something in her face that was not displeasure. It was the look she always had when she understood something about him that he had not yet understood about himself. The look that said, "This is who you are. This is why I married you. This is the thing that our daughters saw in you and learned from and carry with them into the world." That look said everything. He handed her the glass. They left tea. He green-roomed together. The studio lights were being lowered for the evening. The crew was packing equipment. The next segment was being set up on the other side of the building. Outside, the city was dark. The evening was cold. Somewhere in an apartment or a living room or a dorm room, someone was going to watch the clip when it aired the next morning and think about what it meant and maybe, ask themselves the question that Barack had asked in that chair, in that silence under those lights. That was the point. That was always the point. The work was not to win. The work was to leave something behind that outlasted the moment. The work was to plant a seed in a room full of people who were not expecting it, and trust that the soil was good enough, and the light was strong enough, and the seed was viable enough to grow into something that could not be contained. The work was to be strong enough to be gentle. And that was the discipline that mattered.